So I have been tracing in a series of narrations a work that I created in the late 1980s called Displacements. And I had begun revisiting this particular piece because it seemed to me that this issue of passive spectatorship and some of the ramifications that passive spectatorship has in a world in which we're confronted with almost perpetual deployments of violence and trauma creating life experiences. That this idea of being a victim to the theater of the world and being a passive spectator in it is, troubling, and that the political ramifications of not participating in the development of changes in relationship to this theater is equally problematic. I had realized in the course of returning to this piece that in fact another pertinent rationale for re-examining it is that I had begun the piece as a kind of meditation not only on certain aspects of displaced subjects but also traumas. And these two ideas are in some ways contained in the word displacement, but trauma but trauma and separation or isolation were two issues that that this work was engaging. Now, where we're at, I guess, in the course of revisiting this piece is I had begun discussing various aspects of the title, what displacements meant for me at the time, and what they sort of continued to mean in relationship to later work that I produced, and what they might mean today in other contexts. And I had discussed, I think I began with this mathematical idea of displacement as the shortest vector between 2 points, and how as a metaphor for individuals who are excluded from a certain kind of view of a particular idealized subject, right, or unmarked subject, that this vector never truly exists. That we think of the entrance to the library as something abstract and attainable, but for individuals with disabilities, there may be a lot of difficulty getting to that entrance and getting through the door. For individuals in certain social situations that are constrained, there may be a guardian at that door, whether it's a library or some other type of door. So I wanted to explore that idea in this initial piece, and I wanted to explore that idea today. And then the second definition that we looked at was a social political definition of forced displacement, when individuals are forced to move from a place where they live or their residence of because of government intervention, because of a disaster, because they are seen as detrimental to the operation and functions of a state, or they are seen as useful to the operations and functions of a state, and they're used or relocated in certain ways. Now, I'm framing this in very, sort of affect neutral terms, but it's not affect neutral at all. We're talking about things like forced marches. We're talking about things like economic disasters. We're talking about things like genocide. We're talking about, things like human slavery. So they're not affect-free in any way. And I had discussed, some of those kinds of forced displacement and my interest in them, again, at that moment, that early moment, and today, and over the course of the decades in between. And then the third discussion of the title that I want to engage, that I elicited in the 80s, and that bears upon both aspects of my interest in spectatorship, passive spectatorship versus active spectatorship, and the idea of trauma, and does so in some interesting ways, is this sort of Freudian definition, the psychological definition of displacement as a transference of negative affect. And there are a lot of different compartments or components of that. Projection could be seen as one aspect under the header of this type of displacement of negative affect. And it doesn't really necessarily have to be negative affect, but displacement of any kind of suppressed or uncomfortable, right, psychological content from either an object or a subject onto a different object or subject, or toward a different process of integration for that subject experiencing the discomfort. And it occurred to me that in order to fully explore that definition of displacement as from the psychological point of view, that I needed to discuss first the creation of the Alfred E. Newman Theater, which was a conceptual theater that I envisioned sort of brought into consciousness in 1985, and I had been reading Antonin Artaud, and one of the references was to the Alfred Jarry Theater, his initial theater. I had been interested in this play, Him by E.E. Cummings. It's an early example of pretty successful, conceptually successful construction of a theater of the absurd, in which in one moment of this particular play, the fourth wall is literally demolished by a character named Me, and that wall that exists between the living room spaces of Me and him is performatively destroyed, right? So this idea of wall has always been of interest to me for a number of reasons. The metaphor of wall as social separation, and how it's was so became such an important part of this doctrine of neo-fascism under Trump, and it's always been with me in terms of theatrical spaces, finding places that have not necessarily that don't have walls, but they have multiple alcoves, or ways of moving in these labyrinthine theatrical spaces that in which walls are both things that you go around, walk through, find portals of entrance inside of, and just become more interesting constructs. So that was there in this Cummings piece, and I referenced it in the title of this theater with putting his initials in the theater project, after the Alfred, deleting the Jarry, and then adding the Newman, which was a reference to for those of you who read comic books in the whatever 70s, 80s, whatever. I think these still exist. Alfred E. Newman of Mad Magazine, and this theater that I imagined performed in a number of ways conceptually that allowed me to in some sense in aesthetic constructs between aesthetic performances. For example, one of the premises of the Alfred E. Newman Theater, and I'll discuss the theater in more detail in a later piece. This is really a preamble toward a prelude to that discussion of that theater. But one of the ways that I conceptualized that theater was that in this theater, in which one was actively involved in the demolition of fourth walls, that in Cummings' piece Hymn, this demolition was conceived of spatially, right? So that there was this spatial divide between Hymn's living room and me's living room. And this was destroyed. And I thought, well, what if that was a temporal wall as well? We think that we exist here and now, and then what if we could move across space-time constraints as well here and now, and then what if we could move across here and now space-time? What if we could move across here and now space-time? What if we could move across as well barriers? Space-time would also be challenged in different ways, and you can see, or you can kind of pick up on the way that over time my pieces have one could say evolved, but I really more am interested in the way that time moves back and forth in them, and that the past is brought into the present and pushed toward the future, and the way that in discussing this as a kind of spatio-temporal meta theater, I can jump around a lot, and that's part of the process as well. And again, I had discussed why things are constantly being destroyed in the documentation of these projects, and that's to allow these spaces of memory to act as portals in this idea of space-time travel. So the reason that we're talking about the Alfred E. Newman Theater right now in the middle of a discussion of this piece, Displacements, is because I needed to define in some way theater relationships in time to theater a discussion of the Alfred E. Newman my Theater discussion of and its constitution in 1985, and it's because I'm going to engage exploration discussion of events, life events, piece created as forms of theater that are both projective in the future which occurred retroactive. So that I could go back and say, that also this occurred trauma, and today via this construct of the Alfred E. Newman Theater, Albert allowing myself to retroactively constitute as a form of theater. We could call him Alfred. So that will emerge in the discussion of the title that follows Albert Camus in the next few, or perhaps theater. Merely one, installment. So this is that Sisyphus had put death in chains is absurd. That being that Pluto could not endure the sight of his deserted silent empire. Begin after, and this is presented as, like I said, a kind of prelude to that the gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly the stone would roll a rock on its to the top of a mountain. Is absurd. Is absurd. That they had thought. That they had nothing more dreadful. That there is nothing more dreadful. That they had thought that there is nothing more dreadful and hopeless labor. Retroactive. So I could go back and say fact. Well, futile. This occurred before futile. That Sisyphus was the wisest and most prudent of mortals, and
hopeless
via,
labor,
that demolition,
hopeless labor,
simply a fact.
Fourth
is
that
space and
Sisyphus
time
hopeless labor
was
disposed to practice
simply a fact,
the
constituting
profession
these events
of
as
highwaymen,
theatrical
wisest
performances,
and most
whether they
wisest
were,
and
initially
wisest
conceived of
and
in
most
such a
prudent.
manner
That there
or
is no
not.
contradiction in this.
Is a perfectly reasonable
As a prelude
assumption
to
that discussion.
that opinions
I wanted
differ
to do a
as to
reading
the
today
reasons why he
of,
became the feudal laborer
the
of
chapter,
the underworld,
myth of Sisyphus,
is simply
which
a
is
fact.
embedded in
that he is
the
accused
volume
of a
The
certain
Myth
levity
of Sisyphus.
but Albert in regard to the
Camus,
gods
who could also have
is completely
been
absurd.
referenced in
That Sisyphus
that
had
he
put
stole
death in
their
chains
secrets
is absurd.
but
is simply a
wasn't.
fact.
That Pluto
but
could
perhaps,
not endure the
could have
sight
been. So
of his
we'll just
deserted
say
silent
today,
empire
after
after is simply a fact.
adding Albert Camus,
That
or
Pluto
perhaps,
dispatched the god
you
of
could call it-
war,
you could just call it the
who liberated
Albert
death
Camus.
from the hands of her conqueror is
Theater.
absurd, is absurd.
Theater,
That a story
theater,
is told of such
Theater.
an event
theater,
is simply a fact. That you
theater,
have already grasped
Theater.
that Sisyphus
theater,
is the absurd hero
theater,
par
Theater.
excellence is simply
Theater.
a fact.
theater,
Is simply a fact. Is simply a
Theater.
fact. Is simply a
Theater.
fact.
theater,
That Sisyphus is as
Theater.
much through his
Theater.
passions as through his torture. Such an absurd hero is utterly absurd. 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 That his scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted, accomplishing nothing is absurd. Is absurd. That this is the price of this earth that must be paid is simply a fact. Of this earth is simply a fact. Of this earth is simply a fact. That myths are made from the imagination to breathe life into them is simply a fact. That one sees merely the whole effort of a body straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it and push it up a slope 100 times over, is absurd. That one sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the covered mass, the foot wedging it, the fresh start with arms outstretched, the wholly human security of 2 earth-clouded hands, is simply a fact. That at the very end of his long effort, measured by skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved, is absurd. That Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments toward the lower world whence he will have to push it up again is simply a fact. That he goes back down to the plane again and again and again and again is absurd. That during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests us most. Fact. That a face that toils so close to stones is already stone itself is a perfectly reasonable assumption. That we see a man going back down with a heavy yet measured step toward the torment of which he will never know the end is simply a fact. That the hour, like a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering, that is the course of our consciousness, is tragic is because the hero is conscious. The reason such a myth is tragic is because the hero is conscious. Is because the hero is conscious is absurd. That the gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly the stone would fall roll back a rock on its to the top of a mountain is absurd. Is absurd. That they had thought that there is nothing more dreadful. That there is nothing more dreadful. That they had thought that there is nothing more dreadful and hopeless labor is futile fact. Futile. That Sisyphus was the wisest and most prudent of mortals, and hopeless labor, simply a fact. Is that Sisyphus hopeless labor was disposed to practice simply a fact the profession of highwayman. Wisest and most prudent. That there is no contradiction in this is a perfectly reasonable assumption. That opinions differ
as to the reasons why he became the feudal laborer of the underworld is simply a fact. That he is accused of a certain levity in regard to the gods is completely absurd.
That Sisyphus
That
had
he
put death
stole
in
their
chains
secrets
is absurd.
is simply a fact.
That Pluto could not endure the sight of his deserted silent empire after is simply a fact. This event. That Pluto dispatched the god of war, who liberated death from the hands of her conqueror, is absurd. Is absurd. Is absurd. Is absurd. That a story is told of such an event is simply a fact. That you have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero par excellence is simply a fact. Is simply a fact. Is simply a fact. Is simply a fact. That Sisyphus is, as much through his passions as through his torture, such an absurd hero is utterly absurd, is utterly absurd, is utterly absurd, is utterly absurd, is utterly absurd. That his scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted, accomplishing nothing, is absurd. Is absurd. That this is the price of this earth that must be paid is simply a fact. Of this earth is simply a fact. Of this earth is simply a fact. That myths are made from the imagination to breathe life into them is simply a fact. That one sees merely the whole effort of a body straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it and push it up a slope 100 times over, is absurd. That one sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the covered mass, the foot wedging
That it is only tragic
start
in those
with
rare
arms
moments
outstretched,
when it becomes
the holy
conscious
human
is
security of
absurd.
two earth-clouded hands.
That Sisyphus,
is simply
proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious,
that at the very end of
knows
his
the
long
whole
effort
extent of his
measured
wretched
by
condition
skyless space
is
and
simply a
time
fact.
without depth,
That
the
it is what
purpose
he
is
thinks
achieved
of during his
is
descent
absurd.
that the lucidity
that
was to
Sisyphus watches
constitute
the
his
stone
torment at the
rush
same
down
time
in a few
crowns
moments
his
toward the
victory
lower world, whence
is
he
simply
will
a
have to
fact.
push it up again.
That there is no
fact.
fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn.
That he goes
is
back
absurd.
down to the plane again and again.
That the
and
descent
again
is
and again
sometimes performed in
absurd.
sorrow
That during
is
that
simply a
return,
fact.
that pause, that Sisyphus
That it can take place in joy
interests
is
us
absurd.
fact. That a face
That the
that
word
toils
is
so
never
close
so
to
much
stones is
more
already
or less
stone
than a
itself
word
is a fact. Is a perfectly reasonable.
That again,
that we
when
see
fancy
a man
Sisyphus
going back
returning
down
toward
with a
his
heavy
rock,
yet measured step toward the
and the
torment
sorrow
of which
that
he
was
will
the
never know
beginning,
the end again and again.
that the
and
word
again.
that
is
is
never
the hour
so
we
find
find
ourselves
like a
or
breathing
resting
space
place,
which
because
returns
hero
as surely as his
when the image is
that again
that
things
things
too
too
tight
tight
of
of
our
Sisyphus is
tragic,
tragic,
or his
because
wrath
the
is
hero is
consistent,
conscious,
and the sorrow
such a
that
myth
we
is
have to
tragic,
endure
because
because
the
the
hero
hero
is
is
conscious,
because
the
every
hero
moment
is
of
conscious.
is
When this
absurd.
is the rock's victory,
There was
this
no
is when the
rock
images
itself.
of earth
Each
cling
step
too
we
tightly
happen
to
upon
memory,
of
That the
the
workman
fall
of
happiness
today
facts
works
is
every day
absurd.
in his life at the same
That the
task.
boundless
That the
grief is too
workman
heavy
of
to
today
bear is no less
works every
absurd.
day in
That the
his
boundless
life
grief,
at the
when
same
this is the rock's
task
victory,
is simply a
this
fact.
And his
is the rock
fate
itself. That
is
these
that
are
That
the
it is
nights
only
of
tragic
Gethsemane
in those
is
rare
absurd.
moments
Fact.
when
That
it
these
becomes
are the nights
conscious
of
is
Gethsemane.
absurd.
That the boundless
Is
grief is
that
too heavy to
Sisyphus,
bear.
the only
proletarian
tragedy
of the gods,
That
is
the
the
boundless
rare
grief
moments
is
in
rebellious.
in which
knows
the
the
whole
whole
extent.
extent
That
of
Oedipus
my
at the
wretched
outset
condition
these are the
obeys
nights
fate
of
without
Gethsemane
conscience.
is absurd.
That it
That
is
is
tremendous
tremendous
remark
that
from the
that
the reason
despite so
is
many
that it is
distractions
that
that was the
conscious
constant
terrible
of the
stories
same
of
time
Gethsemane
crowns his
his own
victory
tragedy
is
simply a fact.
simply
That
a
Oedipus
fact.
at the outset
That there is no
fate
fate
that ancient
cannot be
wisdom
surmounted by
confirms
sorrow.
that a tremendous
remark
remark
that from the
that
moment he
despite
knows
so
that
many
one does
years
not
that
have
happiness
to
is
be
absurd.
There was no
is that it can take place in
That
joy
happiness
is
absurd.
absurd.
Is absurd.
That ancient
the
wisdom
word is
confirms
never
not
so
in
That
much
the reasons
more
to
or less
this myth
than a word.
works
That they are-
every day
that
of
one
his
does
life.
not that happiness and
That
the
again,
absurd
that
but
again,
two sides
that
of the
again,
same
that
toward his
is
rock
no
less
and the
absurd.
sorrow
happiness
that
and
was
the
the
absurd
beginning
that there would indeed be no
we
torture
find
if at
ourselves
that the only
that
tragedy
they are
absurd.
inseparable.
is the rare
When the
moment
image is
there was no
observed,
in
cling
which
too tightly
in
to
each
memory,
step
they are
of the
inseparable.
life
Happiness
of
becomes
succeeding
insistent.
becomes
Is
conscious,
absurd. We happen
is absurd.
upon the
That the
melancholy
workman
of
that the
today.
reason this myth works every
is
day
tragic.
in
When
his
this
life
is
is
the rock's
because the
victory,
hero
this
is
is the rock
conscious,
itself,
and his own
we happen
tragedy
upon
is no less
the realm
absurd.
of fact.
Is a fact.
That the boundless
there
grief
would
is too
indeed
heavy to
be
bear
no
is
torture
absurd.
if the only
That the
tragedy
boundless grief is too
is the
heavy
rare
to bear
moment
is simply
there was
in
no
which
hope in
such
each step
a
life and such
of
a succeeding becomes conscious is absurd. That the workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and his fate is no less absurd, is a fact.
Relationships in time and space. In my discussion of this Freudian idea of displacement, because I'm going to engage as a discussion of displacements, the piece created in the late 80s, an event which occurred in 1977 that also involves trauma, and that via this construct of the Alfred E. Newman Theater, I'm allowing myself to retroactively constitute as a form of theater. And so that will emerge in the discussion of the title that follows in the next few, or perhaps, merely one, installment of this discussion. So that being the case, I wanted to begin, and this is presented as, like I said, a kind of prelude to a discussion of the Alfred E. Newman Theater and its constitution in 1985 and its exploration of life events as forms of theater that are both projective into the future and retroactive, so that I could go back and say, well, this occurred before the creation of the Alfred E. Newman Theater, but the Alfred E. Newman Theater allows it via that demolition of fourth space-time walls, that it engages in constituting these events as theatrical performances, whether they were initially conceived of in such a manner or not. And so as a prelude to that discussion, I wanted to do a reading today of the chapter The Myth of Sisyphus, which is embedded in the volume The Myth of Sisyphus by Alfred. Excuse me, I said Alfred, obviously thinking about the Alfred E. Newman Theater, but Albert Camus, who could also have been referenced in the Alfred E. Newman Theater, but wasn't, but perhaps could have been. So we'll just say today, maybe adding Albert E. Camus, or perhaps we could call Alfred Camus, or perhaps we could just call it the Albert Camus Theater. So this is the myth of Sisyphus. That the gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly roll a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back on its own weight, is absurd. That they had thought that there is nothing more dreadful in punishment than futile and hopeless labor is simply a fact.